and gentlemen, to talk to us on overpopulation, the elephant in the room. Please welcome Dr. James Hopeward.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. How's the sound? We okay? All right, brilliant. So, some of you might be wondering why my name is James Hopeward and I was introduced as Peter's son. So a year and 10 days ago, Kerry and I got married, and we decided that we would add Hope to my former surname, because 2020 seemed like a really good year to be adding Hope. And I think 2021, it still seems like a pretty good decision. I think what the world needs is hope, and I'm not here to talk to you tonight about desperation, even though when we saw the numbers that were up on the screen, they were pretty large numbers. Okay. So we're here to talk about overpopulation, and we do refer to this as the elephant in the room. Why do we refer to overpopulation as the elephant in the room? Well, it comes from, we need to work out where this picture actually comes from. This picture is actually from about 18 months ago, a news story out of Thailand, when an Asian elephant poked its head into somebody's kitchen. Now you might think that that elephant poked its head, broke that hole in the wall. Not actually the case. It was poking its head through a hole that had been made by a previous elephant some weeks before. And so what's happening in Thailand is that because of urban encroachment into the wild lands, there are actually these conflicts between humans and elephants, which is what brings us to the question that we have come here to talk about, which is, are there too many elephants in Thailand? And I was going to do a whole bit. I was going to put like 40 slides in here, making it look as though I'd got the brief all wrong and that it was a very literal interpretation of elephants breaking into rooms in Thailand. Obviously, that wouldn't have fitted with the introduction that we just had. But I thought it would be nice to lighten the mood, because it is a pretty heavy topic, overpopulation. The idea that, actually, are there too many of us? Now, that's a graphic. That's just I downloaded that off the Property Atlas. It's the picturesque landscape, a very creative urban environment in the Adelaide Hills in Mount Barker. I mean, just imagine growing up in one of these houses with that. In fact, what's the one I was looking at? That one there, I reckon. It's got about 5 square metres of backyard. Are there too many of us? That's what we're here to talk about. And being 7:08 on a Wednesday, let's do some warm-ups and let's do some maths. And I have always said that it's after 7 p.m, you should definitely hit people with a 10-digit number. So the latest official numbers, those numbers that were up on the screen before, when we were all milling about, they were just current estimates. But the official numbers from the Human Population Division, 7,752,840,547, which is up on the previous year official numbers of 7,673,345,391. Which, if you do the maths very quickly, you can find that's an annual growth rate of 1.03%. Now, you might look at that and say, well, hang on a second, 1.03%, that doesn't seem like a big growth rate at all. If you went to a bank and asked for a home loan and they were saying, our interest rates are 1.03%, you would think that was a high interest rate. If a real estate agent was trying to sell you a house and saying, oh, property prices around here are skyrocketing, they're going up at 1.03%, you wouldn't think that was a high growth rate. Why should we worry about that with population? Isn't it a really low growth rate? Well, yes and no. Depends on the time frame. It depends on what's growing. If my property price is growing at 1.03%, maybe that isn't an issue. Maybe it is. Don't worry, we're not going to be doing loads and loads of maths. This is the first of, I think, only 13 or 14 equations I'm going to hit you with. So, basically we're just saying, no, obviously this is the only equation I'm going to hit you with. The future population is the current population multiplied by this thing, and this is the exponential function. If the population is growing steadily, it's the same as compound interest. Okay? e to the kt. K is a growth rate. That's the 1.03%, that's the growth rate. T is the number of years. So you can do that calculation, and we're going to do a few calculations actually, because we can start from the current estimated population of 7.8 billion. That's the last official population. We can see from the numbers that were on the screen earlier, it's probably close to 7.9 billion already. But starting at 7.8 billion, we can project this out over some meaningful timeframes. So let's just test this hypothesis. Let's be a bit scientific about it. The hypothesis is that 1.03% is not a really significant growth rate. Let's test that hypothesis and let's take some meaningful timeframes. If we assume that our civilization should endure for many, many generations, many human lifetimes, then the first relevant time frame should be one human lifetime, which on current life expectancy in Australia is 83 years. Projecting from 7.8 billion, current population official numbers, at 1.03% per year for 83 years, would have a global population of 18.2 billion. Now you might look at that and think, that number means nothing to me. Okay, if Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos wanted to, if they were still alive in 83 years, they could give $10, they could each give $10 to every man and child on the planet and still be billionaires. We can have a whole conversation about that. Let's scoot ahead to another time frame. This time frame is of relevance in this country, 233 years of colonisation, of occupation of these Aboriginal lands. So if we project from today's population of 7.8 billion at 1.03% per annum for 233 years, so one more cycle of that length of time, we get to about a bit more than 10 times the current population. Now, hopefully you're looking at that and thinking, well, wait a minute, 1%, that's 1/100th. So you might be inclined to think that 1 over 100 times 100 years gets you to double the population, and therefore 200 years should get you to 3 times the population. It's 10 times the population, and this is the power of that exponential function, even at this 1.03% per annum. The next and the final time frame that we'll look at, bearing in mind, we had the acknowledgement that we're meeting on the lands of the Kaurna people already. We have so much to learn about time that we could learn from First Nations people here and in other parts of the world. Timeframes that are long to us may not seem long to other cultures. Us, I should have prefaced that. Me as a European descendant, non-Aboriginal person. So here's a time frame. There are pubs in England that are reported to have been continuously operating as pubs for 1,000 years or more. So let's take that 1,000 years, and I'm going to throw this open. I know Q&A is not happening till the end, so we'll keep your identity secret if you would like to participate. Who would like to hazard a guess? We've got this trajectory from 18 billion to 85 billion. Who wants to throw a number at me? 2 trillion. 2 trillion? What? 2 trillion? I was going to run this thing like a bit of an auction, but I was hoping the bidding would start a little bit lower. 2 trillion, that's a great guess. I run these little experiments with my engineering students, and I think that's the highest anybody's ever guessed. Unfortunately, we didn't meet the reserve price. 200 trillion. Now that number means nothing to anybody. What on earth does 232 trillion people look like? Well, I've been thinking about how to visualise this. I want us to all just do a little visualisation, because you might think, well, these just all look like big numbers. They all end with illion. Million, billion, trillion, what does it all mean? Okay, 232 trillion is basically more than one person per square metre on every square metre of land surface on the planet. So what I want you to think about is, imagine you're at Adelaide Oval, and it is a full crowd, which is about 53,000 people. Can we picture that? The crowd, the noise, the smell. There are the people down there on the grass, playing with a ball or whatever. And the siren goes, or the whistle blows, or whatever they do. Unfortunately, however, this is where we all live. There is nowhere else to go because outside of those walls is another stadium, and outside of that is another stadium, and so it goes in every direction until we reach the coastline. Every square metre of Australia is football stadium filled to capacity. That's what 232 trillion looks like, and that's where it would be everywhere on the planet. Now, when we run out of hot dogs or other food, that's it. We can't grow much food down there on the grass in the stadium when there's 53,000 of us. Okay, so what do we learn? Well, we learn that exponential growth, it can't be a permanent system state. In fact, it never is. There's no physical system, no biological system, physical system, ecological system, or anything in the universe that has exponential growth as a permanent system state. Think about it. Feedback in an electronic circuit. If I went and shoved this microphone in front of one of those speakers, or wherever the speakers are, we'd get that horrible feedback sound. That's exponential growth, but it doesn't continue growing. It gets to a certain point, and then something happens in the circuit. So in fact, growth is only a transient state. It happens on the way to a steady state. What's on the screen there is called logistic growth, or can be called logistic growth. Or it happens on the way to a peak and decline. So growth is never a permanent state. Our population is growing, but that growth is not a permanent state. So we don't have to worry about those numbers that are on the previous slide. Well, we do have to worry about them, but we don't have to worry about actually reaching 232 trillion people. But that's not really what we're here to talk about. We want to know, is human overpopulation an issue now? How do we work that out? Well, I was thinking about this. I was thinking, how can we talk about it? Well, there's 7.8 billion of us. How does that compare to other animals on the planet? We are a primate. What's the next most populous primate? Well, it's a thing apparently called the crab-eating macaque, of which there are 2.5 million, which means that for every one of these happy little characters, there's 3,000 of us. If we go a little bit closer to home, to chimpanzees, our closest evolutionary relative, there's only 300,000 of those estimated in the world. It means there's 25,000 human beings for every one chimpanzee. If we want to get to animals that have population numbers anything like humans, in fact, we have to go to plague species. And the mouse might be the only mammal that outnumbers humans. There are certainly not very many species that do. And of course, a mouse is not very big. It doesn't require very many resources to sustain it. Very few mice drive cars. Okay, so let's actually look at this in more scientific terms. By the way, I'll do just a small number of references here. They've been provided, or they will be provided, in the same Dropbox link that's been provided for this event. So wild mammals, measured in terms of total biomass, millions of tons of carbon. So if we just worked out we are whatever percent, 20 or 30% carbon, do the same thing for the wild mammals, which, by the way, includes all of the elephants in Thailand. It's about 6 million tonnes of carbon. You want to see how many million tonnes of carbon there are of humans? About 60. About 10 times more. So if we had a giant set of scales and we put all of the wild mammals, all of the blue whales, the humpback whales, all of the zebras and wildebeest across Africa, all of the chimpanzees, crab-eating macaques, all the wild mammals, humans would outweigh them tenfold. And of course, we don't come to the party alone, because we have all of our animals as well. So domesticated animals are even heavier than us. So putting humans and domesticated animals together, we dwarf the total biomass of wild mammals on this planet. Our presence is most definitely being felt. So that's one answer to this question about human overpopulation. Is it an issue now? Well, we're certainly a significant part of the biomass on the planet. So that's a snapshot of where it's at. Now let's think about where it's been coming from and where it might be going. There's a concept called the Great Acceleration. I'm going to throw a series of graphs at you. Don't worry, they're easy to understand. They all start at 1750, being roughly the Industrial Revolution. They all have this dotted line at 1950 being roughly what we could say is the dawn of modern industrial civilization. Things became common in 1950 and beyond, after 1950. Things like air travel, things like cars becoming ubiquitous, the rise, or the dawn and then rise of information technology and things like that. So we're going to just keep these axes on the screen and we're just going to look at a few measures of the human presence on the planet, starting of course with our population. Less than 1 billion when we had the Industrial Revolution. The dawn of modern industrial civilization, about 2.5 billion, and it's gone up by a factor of 3. Of course, these numbers are now slightly out of date. Okay? Factor of 3 population. Primary energy use, factor of 5 since the 1950s. Fertilizer consumption, fueling modern agriculture, 8-fold increase. Real GDP, that's taking out inflation, and just the real economic activity has increased by something like a factor of 10 during that time. Carbon dioxide concentrations, we're talking about a planetary scale impact, 30% increase. We talked about nitrogen being used, what was it, 8 times or 10 times? The coastal nitrogen flux, about a 5-fold increase. That's the flux of those nutrients out into the oceans. While we're talking about oceans, let's think about what we're taking back out of the oceans. Marine fish capture, up by a 5-fold. So we've increased the pollution we're discharging into the ocean at the same time as we've increased the take of wild fish from there. Biodiversity, the abundance of species in the biosphere, or the loss of species abundance from the biosphere, increases by a factor of 2 over the same time frame. By many, many measures, therefore, we can say our impact has been accelerating greatly. Still haven't answered the question, have I? Are there too many of us? Are there too many people on the planet? Well, to answer this question, we need to look at the field of ecology. And ecology talks about a concept known as carrying capacity. Who's heard of carrying capacity? About 4 hands went up, maybe 5. Okay, excellent. Could I explain it using an example? Imagine that you're farming. I don't know if anyone here has a background in farming, but imagine you have a paddock. And the paddock can hold 100 sheep. That's what we know. It's got a certain amount of pasture. You know the land. This land can hold 100 sheep, and you've currently got 50 sheep. You're below carrying capacity. Now you have a really good lambing year, and you end up with your 50 sheep plus another 50 lambs, and these become 100 sheep. If you start off within carrying capacity, then you can grow and then slow your growth and remain within carrying capacity, in theory. Okay? However, if you're above carrying capacity, so let's imagine that farming example, you've got a capacity of 100 sheep, maybe you started with 60, you had a good lambing and now you're at 120. You're above that carrying capacity. The world doesn't immediately end. You can go into what's called overshoot. So the sheep are moving around, they're grazing, and they've grazed down that bit of pasture, and they move over to this part of the paddock, and they start grazing that, and then that runs down, they go back over here. If they were within carrying capacity, that pasture would have regrown, and then they'd move back, and this would have regrown. If we're above carrying capacity, they come back here, it's only half grown. They graze that down to the ground, and they move over here, this is only half grown. They graze it down to the ground. Fairly soon, they're grazing into the roots, and they're eating the seeds that would have been the next crop of pasture. So you can sustain those high numbers above carrying capacity for a while, but not forever. And what happens when they start grazing down into the roots? The topsoil blows away. That carrying capacity line is eroded, quite literally in that example. Now our paddock that once supported 100 sheep might only support 10 sheep, or none. And we enter a collapse phase in our population. This has been observed in a profound way. This is an island in the Bering Sea, St Matthew Island. It's about 1/10 the size of Kangaroo Island. And in the 1940s, someone hatched the genius plan of introducing a population of reindeer onto the island. They introduced 29 reindeer. Someone has subsequently estimated the carrying capacity of this island to be about 1,600 reindeer. But reindeer don't naturally control their own population, and they had a pretty good time on the island. And within about 15 years, they had reached the dizzying heights of 6,000 reindeer. Now, do we know what's about to happen? How long do you think it took for the population to fall? 20 years? About 2 years. When people went back and surveyed the population, they found 42 remaining reindeer, down from 6,000 about 2 years before. Overshoot is real. So, are we an overshoot? Very, very difficult question. Reindeer are somewhat simple. They reproduce and they eat. So the number of reindeer is a pretty good gauge of the impact that they're having on the environment. Humans are much more complicated. So we look at a global level, we can look at a concept called planetary boundaries. So some scientists have evaluated a whole bunch of different planetary boundaries, and these are thresholds. So they're not strict carrying capacity limits, but we can certainly use them in that way. So think of all those graphs I showed you of the great acceleration. In many cases, where we've got to is thought to be beyond what would constitute a stable planetary system. In some cases, greatly exceeding what we would consider to be a stable planetary threshold. So, our impact, as measured by a large number of different measures, is considered to be beyond the carrying capacity of the planet. Which is not really surprising when you think that we are 3,000 times more populous than the next most populous primate. Interestingly, the one that we're still within capacity for is freshwater use. So, what does this mean? Well, getting to sustainable living on a single planet, it isn't actually entirely about how many people there are. That is definitely part of it. But we're really talking about the impact. Those are all different measures of impact. Carbon dioxide concentration is one. Species loss is another. Discharge of nitrogen into the ocean is another. These are all different impacts. Each one of those can be represented by what we call the IPAT equation, coined by Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb. But prior to him writing The Population Bomb, it was coined by Paul Ehrlich and Mark Holdren. Mark Holdren went on to become the scientific advisor for Barack Obama in the United States. I believe this is also linked in the documents associated with this talk. So the IPAT equation is impact is equal to population times affluence times technology. To put that another way, it's a function, it's saying our impact is a function of how many of us there are, our per capita consumption, and then how clean our consumption is. Okay, I could consume a lot of bioplastic, for example, or I could consume a small amount of some toxic petrochemical plastic. So the amount that we consume and how clean is the stuff that we're consuming are two very important things. But multiply these two together with our population and we can work out our impact. We can work out our impact in all of those different categories, like carbon dioxide concentrations, like coastal nitrogen flux, and so on. And then we can work out if we're beyond the carrying capacity, beyond that planetary threshold, what needs to happen? Well, some way or another, we need to pass through our overshoot phase and bring our impact down to within carrying capacity, and we need to do it in such a way and in a timely fashion so that we don't erode the carrying capacity in each of those categories. That's the challenge ahead of us. It's a function of how clean our technology is, how much we're consuming per person, and of course, our population. So, I'm going to throw a graph onto the screen, and it's got so much detail on it, it's going to be a little overwhelming. Don't worry, I'll walk you through it. There's also a link, so you can find some great resource out of what's affiliated with the University of Oxford. Lots and lots of information. The coming slides are all from the same source, which is also derived from the UN Population Division. So you can't necessarily make out all of those numbers. You've already been told, in fact, that around 1800, the world reached an estimated population of 1 billion people. It took about 120 years to double from 1 billion to 2 billion, estimated. So this green shape here is the world population. The darker part of it is historical, and the slightly lighter part of it up here is projected population, out to the end of this century. The funny line above it, well, that's the population growth rate. Now, I did tell you I was only going to show you one equation. This is the same equation, don't get too upset. So that K term, that was 1.03%, we did the maths. That's what the population growth rate is about now. But if we look at this line, that's the growth rate over time. So around the early part of the 20th century, there was this inflection point where the growth rate in the population suddenly started to rise, and it rose as high as about 2% by around 1970. So in fact, the population has not been growing at a stable, or steady, I should say, exponential growth rate. It's been more like a variable interest rate. So it rose up, and it came back down. During that time, because whether it's 1% or 2%, these are still reasonably high growth rates as far as populations are concerned, the population accelerated rapidly, which is what took us from the 2.5 billion in 1950 to nearly 8 billion now. So it took 120 years to go from 1 billion to 2 billion, and in the next 100 or so years, it didn't double, but it nearly quadrupled. And that's because that growth rate was so high. But does anybody else find that really interesting, that it went up so high, and then it's come down so steeply? I feel like we should look at that a bit more, because population is kind of intriguing, the way it grows over time. So and then let's look at what's going to happen, or what might happen, it's projected to happen, if it continues to fall. And it's ending here, you might not be able to see that. That says 0.1%. So a tenth of the current growth rate. And you can see this change from a rapidly accelerating population. The curve, we've talked a lot about flattening the curve, haven't we, in the last 18 months? Well, look, that's a curve that's flattening as well. Granted, it's reaching about 11 billion people by the end of the century. But let's have a look in more detail at what was happening around 1950, and let's try and understand population a little better. So this is what's called population age, can be called an age pyramid, which is called age structure. Roughly divided into 20-year blocks, because that sort of corresponds to generations, if you like. So 1950, the population, this is the global population age structure, looked like this. A very small number of very senior citizens, and quite a large number of youth in the population. Now, you could broadly say that this age group are the reproductive age group, the parents of the world, and this age group are, very broadly speaking, the children of that age group. Anyone notice anything about those two groups? Are they the same size? No, the bottom group is a little bit bigger. Perhaps for every 2 adults, there are perhaps 3 children. So that suggests that in 1950, on a global average basis, the world was, we would say, above replacement level fertility. Replacement level fertility, as the name suggests, would just be sort of every adult is essentially being replaced by the next generation. So for every 2 adults, there are 2 children. For every 2 adults in the reproductive age group, that is. Of course, there are other adults up here. So we're going to look at this through time, because we want to see what was happening in that strange period where the growth rate went really high. So let's fast forward a year. Not a year, a decade. So half the people that were in this group are now up in that group, half of the ones that were in there are up in here, and so on. So the population has grown. We still have that difference between the reproductive age group and the children of the reproductive age group. In fact, if I had to guess, I'd say that the ratio was perhaps growing a little bit. It's in the 60s. Okay, let's have a look at the 70s. In the 70s, we have what I would characterise as a flared age pyramid. If you go to any country that has a rapidly growing population, I can guarantee it will have this same structure. Countries with a high fertility rate have this flared structure, and in 1970 or thereabouts, we are at peak flare. So this shape carried forward into the 1980s, but by 1990 we can see it's starting to straighten. Skip ahead to present conditions and we've got this mushroom type shape. It's straightening out at the edges. What that means, of course, is that the reproductive age group are getting much closer to replacement level fertility. If we then just remember that trajectory showed the blue line went down almost to zero and the red line went up and sort of slowed down, the population was slowing down. So by 2050 we have this sort of beehive shape, and by 2100 we have this very straight-sided age structure. Interestingly, though, the number of people entering the population through birth could well still outweigh the number of people exiting the population. Age-specific mortality rates increase as we go up the age pyramid. So even though we get to a replacement level fertility, the population can continue to rise for quite some time because there can still be a mathematical increase in terms of births minus deaths. So take-home points from the age structure. Well, the stationary population, which is the word demographers use for a population that's not growing, has those vertical sides. Now that might seem like a really boring point to make. You know, go home and you can get yourself to sleep remembering that point. But it's actually important from the point of view of how our society is structured. If you're in a society that has that flared age distribution, think about the ratio in terms of the number of people at working age and the number of people in school versus the number of retirees. Now think about a population that has those straight sides in terms of those ratios. I'm not saying one is better than the other, I'm just saying it's significant. More significant perhaps than you might immediately think, which is why I made that point. That's one point. The other point is the point I've already made, which is that it takes a really long time. You don't just get to 2 children per adult couple and immediately have zero population growth. In fact, it takes many, many years. If you want proof of that, have a look at China's population. China's already mentioned once. 42 years ago, China implemented the one-child policy. I'm not going to talk much about it, but purely from a demographic point of view, China's population is still growing. So the fertility rate dropped because of that policy. If the policy was kept in place, it would have taken 50 years to reach a stationary population. During those 50 years, China's population would have increased 50%. And that is because of this births outweighing deaths, even when you impose something as draconian as a one-child policy. All right? Here's the thing, well, this is why we need to talk about this. We need to understand it. It's not a simple issue, it's not a simple problem, and it certainly doesn't have a simple solution. Okay? As was mentioned, I spent 12 months attempting to run Sustainable Population Australia, which is an environmental charity that is trying to raise awareness of overpopulation, both at a national level and at a global level. And what I found was this is an extremely difficult issue to talk about. Why? Well, I lied, didn't I? That's another equation, I'm sorry. The change in population, very simply, if you're at a national level, is births minus deaths plus or minus immigration. These are the only ways the population can change. And if we're at the global level, it's just births minus deaths. Right? Which means, if you want to have a conversation with anybody about reducing population growth, the only options you have, mathematically, are to call for fewer births, more deaths, or less migration, and every single one of those has the potential to offend people. You cannot start a conversation about reducing population without it blowing up in your face. And I maintain that is the reason. It's a very simple mathematical reason. This is an ideological minefield. We basically can't have a conversation about reducing population. So we need to come at this a different way. So I think we need to get to square one, which is that get to a goal we can all agree on. Why do we need a goal we can all agree on? Well, to borrow a phrase from the great baseballer philosopher, Yogi Berra, if we don't know where we're going, we'll end up someplace else. Makes sense, doesn't it? And with due respect to the Berra family, I think he was smarter than the average Berra. So, a palatable long-term goal, I would hope, is that we all live well, we live sustainably, and we live equitably on one planet. Now, I know that there are billionaires who are trying to turn us into a multi-planetary society, but at best, if we end up with a few dozen people, heck, if we end up with a few thousand people living on Mars or elsewhere, it isn't going to do much about the billions and billions of people on this planet. So, I would hope that that's a palatable goal. If it isn't, then I'm not quite sure where we go. If we can't get to that point where we can agree, sure, we might disagree on timeframes, we might disagree on methods for getting to that point, but if we can't at least agree that that's a pretty good thing to aim for as a species, then we've got a real problem. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that we find ourselves within, and hopefully well within, the carrying capacity, as measured by all of those different impacts and any other impacts. All of our impacts are well within the carrying capacity of the planet, and people have a fair share of the pie. Okay? We can't really have a goal that violates point one, because that's akin to sort of saying, I want to overgraze my paddock and crash the population of sheep. That doesn't make any sense. And I would hope that no one thinks, well, I would actually aspire to having a planet where we don't have a fair share. Now, we might be able to debate about whether it's feasible to get to a fair share and so on, but hopefully we could at least agree on that being a goal. So, unfortunately, the environmental movement seems prone to polarisation, like many movements. I guess religious movements are probably prone to polarisation as well. So, going back to that equation, one of the things I felt when I was working at Sustainable Population Australia, or volunteering I should say, it was almost like people carved up this equation. And some people became population advocates or population reduction advocates, and some people became consumption reduction advocates. And would sort of say, well, according to my lens, which is population reduction, that's the only thing that matters. And then other people would say, well, my lens is consumption reduction, that's the only thing that matters. And I always thought, well, if 2 times 3 times 4 is 24, you can't say, well, I am going to campaign for the 3, that's the most important. Or the 2, that's the most important. Or the 4, that's the most important. You need all of them to multiply together to get the answer. Okay? So while half of the environmental movement is at war with the other half, we have green growth advocates who are just campaigning for the T and saying it doesn't really matter whether our population grows or whether our consumption grows, we're just going to clean everything up and power everything with renewable energy and recycle everything and it'll all be fine. Point is, if any one of these things just keeps on growing, eventually it will drive the impact up. Okay. So, let's look at this, and it's a little bit like that famous poem, The Blind People and the Elephant, where sort of depending on what part of the elephant you're touching, you sort of think, oh, it's a rope or it's a snake or it's a tree. And if you can sort of zoom out, you realise, oh, well, it's actually just one thing. And it's sort of all of those things and none of those things. Okay. We need to have that more holistic approach to the population consumption problem, in my opinion. Okay. As we know, we're already in overshoot. Even if you are sceptical about any of those measures, there are just too many of them to ignore. Okay? So, and I would argue that in at least a fair chunk of them, we're in overshoot. The challenge we've got is to bring our impact within carrying capacity. In fact, our impact will come down to within carrying capacity by itself. It's just a matter of how low the carrying capacity drops due to damage to the biosphere and the atmosphere. So our challenge is not just to bring our impact down, but to limit the damage to the carrying capacity so that we can then hopefully not reduce our level of well-being down to the bottom of the graph. So, that's the challenge ahead of us. And that challenge, in pretty much a best case scenario, takes place with population rising to 10 to 11 billion people. We might be lucky and have population coming in at under 10 billion. But I'm going to show you some graphs of fertility soon. All right. Going back to that polarisation issue, it really gets to me. Promoting population reduction, as though consumption doesn't matter, is really problematic, especially if we're taking this line from within a very high consuming country. It's a little bit like saying, we ate all the pie. Well, we didn't eat all the pie, we saved a bit. But there's too many of you to share it. That's how it's perceived. It may not be presented, and certainly the people who I met in Sustainable Population Australia did not intend their argument to be taken that way, but it is usually how it is perceived. It's perceived as a deeply unethical position. When people in rich, very high consumption countries promote population reduction, especially in low income countries, as though per capita consumption doesn't matter. So that's a problematic discourse. We also need to face the demographic reality. We need to understand those age structures. That's why I spent a bit of time on them tonight. We need to understand that there is momentum through the generations. We are likely to get to 10 to 11 billion. Most of that growth will happen in low-income countries where people don't currently have a fair share, and then there'll be even more people. So we need to bring the consumption argument, the per capita consumption argument, into the population discussion. Meanwhile, promoting consumption reduction as though population doesn't matter is equally problematic, because this neglects the fact that even if we bake a new pie, a clean pie, a green pie, the more people there are, the smaller everybody's share of that pie. Or put it another way, the smaller nature gets to share in that pie as well, right? And now I'm an environmental engineer, so I work alongside people who are developing clean technologies, ways of consuming things in a more clean and green way. But the more people we have, the more we drive that impact curve up, the more we require that technology to pull it back down. So the more people we have, or the more consumption we have, the greater the challenge in terms of cleaning up our technology, and there are limits to how efficient we can be. There are limits to how clean we can be. We could change all of our fossil fuel over to renewable energy. It still has an impact on the planet. Solar farms have an impact. Wind farms have an impact. I'm not against either of those technologies, but we need to recognise that clean technology won't deliver us from growth. Okay, so let's frame the conversation properly. Now, first, we need to acknowledge our own context and we need to acknowledge our privilege. I'm a white male, highly educated, in one of the richest countries on the planet. That places me in one of the highest privilege categories the world has ever known. That's my privilege. That flavours my opinions about everything I talk about. I have to acknowledge that. The context, I'm talking to you in an Australian context. Okay? So are we in a country that, or a place that has fertility that is above or below replacement level? That's a context that is relevant to how we approach this and how we frame the conversation. Are we in a place where our consumption levels are higher or lower than what we would deem to be a fair share globally? So let's frame the conversation in the right way, and then we can have the conversation, rather than skipping over that bit and saying we need to reduce population tomorrow, or we need to reduce consumption tomorrow. Let's actually get the steps right, so we don't offend people. Step 2, let's state that long-term goal. Let's make it explicit. Let's say we want to live well. It's not just enough to be sustainable. We want to live well. We want everyone to live well, and well within the carrying capacity of the planet. Okay? Let's get that goal right. It's a long-term goal. It's a global goal, and we want everyone to have a fair share. Let's put that out there in the open. Let's frame this conversation, first of all, around our context and privilege, second, around the long-term goal, and then, and only then, can we talk about framing the actions with an appropriate scope. Are we talking about a global approach? Are we talking about a national approach or a local approach? Let's not skip ahead. Let's get the steps right. And then we have the conversation properly. And if there's one thing that we really need, it's we need to have this conversation properly. So I'm going to get winding up fairly soon. So the first proposition is the longer that we delay the transition to that stationary population, the non-growing global population, the larger it will be, and that is fairly obvious, and the smaller will be the globally equitable fair share. Okay? There are limits to how big a pie we can bake with sustainable ingredients. If we have to share it among 10 billion people, that's better than sharing it among 15 billion people. Okay? All right? So let's look at some possible trajectories for population. Reported as children per woman, that's the standard measure of fertility. Replacement level is actually about 2.1 children per woman, accounting for the fact that not all people go on to reproduce on average. So low to medium income and high income countries have had a fairly similar trajectory. It's just that high income countries have already gone down through the replacement level and are in that gradual stabilisation phase. That doesn't mean that high income countries have declining populations. It means they're in that phase where they've got the straight edges and they're waiting for, or in a few cases, populations are slightly declining. But in most cases, they're at fairly stable populations according to births minus deaths. In most cases, they're maybe just still slightly growing according to natural increase. Low to medium countries are just breaking into that replacement level, which means there's probably another 50 years or so of population growth ahead, waiting for that equilibration between births and deaths. And the low-income countries are still substantially above replacement level, but fertility is coming down. At a worldwide level, taking an average, population-weighted average, we're roughly at replacement level, as we've already seen. So projecting these forward, the United Nations does these projections. What's really important here, from a human well-being point of view, is that this projected decline in fertility is also correlated with the alleviation of poverty. So the highest fertility rates are correlated with the lowest economic well-being on the planet. This is well established. So the more rapidly fertility can decline, as long as it is coupled with economic development, this is a win in terms of well-being, human well-being and human welfare in these countries. If fertility is allowed to remain high, then that is likely to remain correlated with poverty, and we hear about the poverty trap in many low-income countries. So this becomes an ethical imperative in terms of human well-being and human welfare, as well as contributing to bringing the whole planet to within a stable and stationary population. Okay, proposition 2. The longer we, in the over-consuming world, where fertility rates are low but consumption is very high, the longer we delay the transition that we need to make, which is to a low-consumption lifestyle, bringing our share of the pie down to something that is equitable, the harder it will be for low-income countries to develop. Remember, fertility reduction is correlated with poverty alleviation, so the more we hog the pie, the less pie is available for those countries that need to develop economically and reduce fertility at the same time. And the longer we stay consuming vast amounts of the planet's resources in these countries, the greater the risk that we actually erode that carrying capacity down to something that's no longer sustainable. That blue line, the number of sheep the paddock can hold. So we've got some work ahead of us. A possible trajectory. It may not be possible, it may be plausible. These are some back-of-the-envelope calculations. Energy, that's exajoules per year. I can explain that if anyone's interested. I doubt you are. But energy is a good kind of catch-all measure because it sort of is a measure of how much we're doing. So it's related to how much stuff we're putting into the atmosphere. It's related to how many fish we're taking out of the ocean. It's related to how much land we're farming and so on. So energy is a pretty good proxy for all of the other impacts. So how big a pie could we bake out of clean energy? Very good question. Hard to get an answer. I've drawn a line here, which is a very optimistic doubling of the world's energy system. So taking all of the fossil fuels that we currently use and all of the other types of energy that we currently use and doubling it, and let's assume that's all clean and green. It's a very optimistic idea. And then let's share it equally among 11 billion people. So it's a conservative estimate of how big a slice everybody could get. And let's imagine we equilibrate and everyone gets to that fair share by the end of this century, being around the time that we are hopefully getting to a stable and stationary population. Well, the lowest income countries, in fact even up to the upper middle income countries, could appreciate and could enjoy a slight rise. Upper middle income countries maybe a 20% rise in energy use per person. The lowest income countries could enjoy maybe a 4-fold increase. Think of all the stuff that you could do with 4 times the amount of energy per person in low income countries. For us in high income countries, we would need to reduce our energy consumption per person by about 50%. Now you might think that sounds hideous, but actually we've got a fair bit of slack in the system. Okay, we might have to turn off that second fridge in the shed. We might have to rethink some of the things that we do with energy. But actually, if this would get us to a globally equitable fair share, then I think it's something we could probably come at doing. We certainly should have that conversation. So, last slide. What can we do about this? Well, if we're coming at this from an Australian context, with all of the privilege that comes with that, noting that, of course, different people in Australia have different levels of privilege, and I've noted mine. But at a national level, we are a high-income country. Our context is we have below replacement level fertility, although our population is increasing. It's increasing about half due to natural increase, which is births minus deaths, and about the other half due to importation of skilled migrants. As I said before, impossible to have a conversation without treading on a landmine of some kind. Okay? But we have below replacement level fertility and well above a fair share in terms of our consumption by many measures. Okay? So what would our priority actions be? What should we campaign for? What should we write to our local MP about? Well, first and foremost, here in this country we should be talking about reducing our per capita consumption towards a global fair share and promoting the benefits of a non-growing population. We shouldn't have an economic system that depends on population growth. We should actually be saying we've been through that demographic transition, we're nearly at the end of it, and we should now be exploring how a mature population should be. To set a good example for other countries that are yet to go through the same demographic transition. So we should be promoting the benefits, and there are benefits of a non-growing population. And in terms of our outward look towards other countries, we should be assisting low-income countries to do 2 things, or to do many things, but 2 in this context. One is reduce fertility, coupled with increasing per capita consumption, at the same time that we are trying to decrease per capita consumption. Countries that are not yet at the fair share should be allowed to increase and should be encouraged to increase. And these can be wrapped up in a suite of policies aimed at education and empowerment of women, access and promotion of family planning and contraception, and programs for economic development. So that is what we should be doing, in my opinion, and thank you very much for your attention.